Thank you everybody for being here this evening. I am super excited to be able to share my enthusiasm for lichens with you all. So I hope I gotta click over to my other screen here. Hold on just a sec. There we go. All right, I have control now. So my name is Erin Rhodes, and I am part of the New York Master Naturalist program. And I have a background in environmental ethics. I am currently the Deputy Director of a regional land and water conservation organization in Maine called Midcoast Conservancy. I am not a technically certified lichen expert, but I am a lichen lover and amateur lichen citizen scientist. I've been appreciating lichens for my whole life and studying them more seriously for the past 5 years. And so I'll share with you some of what I've learned, and I look forward to hearing your questions and maybe learning something from you as well. Ooh, I keep losing my control. Here we go. So as a child, I actually was obsessed with lichens and I didn't even know it. What I was really loving was the smell of the sun on alpine rocks. You know, when you climb up to the top of an open hill, and the way that the sun hits the rocks and that special smell was one of my favorite smells in the world. And I would climb up to the top of a hill or a mountain just to be able to smell that smell. And that's really the smell of lichen. And then I started looking around to figure out what creates that smell, and I discovered lichen. More recently, I started delving into the many different kinds of lichen when I was staying at a friend's cabin up in the Adirondacks. And it was one of those really dreary, drenching rain weeks. And I was just sort of trapped in this cabin. I'm okay with taking a hike in the rain, but this was like a real soaker of a week. And in that cabin, she had a lichen identification book. And so I started reading the intro, and it was telling me what lichens were. And lichens are really weird. We'll get into that in a minute. And so I was like, whoa, this is bizarre. Let me see if I can find some of these crazy lichens that this book is telling me about. And I started doing a little spiral outside the cabin. And by the time 3 days were up, because it took me about 3 days, I found almost all the lichens in that book, just in a little spiral around her cabin, because the Adirondacks are one of the most lichen-rich places in this entire continent, actually in the whole world. And we'll get into some of the different types of lichens that we can identify in the New York area in a little bit. But it was a great way to really become obsessed with lichens, just being able to learn a little bit about the theory and then walk right out of the cabin and see so many different kinds of lichens right there. And rainy times like the spring, and when there aren't too many other things growing around them, are actually the best time to appreciate lichens, because the rain perks them up and makes them nice and happy and springy and really brings out their best selves. So a sort of dreary spring day is one of the best times to go out and appreciate lichens. So today we're going to go over some of the uses of lichens, because they actually have many practical uses. Some of the things that are threatening lichens, the general types of lichens, so how we classify them, their structure and biology, which is where I'll get into why they're so weird, some of the common species that you'll find around New York, books and resources if you want to be delving further on your lichen journey, and we'll have some time for questions at the end, hopefully. So jot down some of the questions that are occurring to you as we go. So I'm just going to dive right in and start talking about some of the ways that lichens are useful to us. And this has been something that people have been using for a very long time. If you know of one of the lichen uses, you might know that we have been using lichens to dye fabrics for a very long time. And they make really good dyes. So for instance, traditional Scottish kilts have long been dyed with lichen. They're still used today to create the ancient style plaids, like you'll see on the left-hand side of your screen here. Lichens used for dyes is called crotal in Scottish Gaelic. And during the European medieval times, the coastal lichen species Rosella was gathered to produce a deep purple color called orciel. Only kings and high church officials were allowed to wear clothing dyed with orciel. Lichen such as wolf lichen was used for chartreuse colors by native North Americans to dye clothes and rugs. And hold on just a sec. There we go. In France, France uses lichens to this day in perfume making. They use oak moss, which is actually a lichen despite its name, and it's collected from oak trees. And they also use a species called tree moss, which grows on pine and cedar trees. And France uses so much lichen that approximately 700 tons of oak moss alone are currently processed each year in France. And it takes a lot of lichen to create a ton because it's very lightweight, very fluffy. And so it's an astounding amount of lichen that's harvested every year. And lichen's one of those things that can't really be grown commercially. So all of the lichen that is used for all of these uses is gathered from the wild. Lichen has been used for a very long time and is still occasionally used as a poison. Wolf lichen, which is the same one I mentioned previously as having a very excellent use as a chartreuse dye, and you can see that nice chartreuse color on the right-hand side. It has volcanic acid in it, and it was used to poison wolves and foxes, which is why it was called wolf lichen. Now, we'll be talking about some of the types of uses for lichens where we'll mention potential edibility and other things. We have to be really, really careful because 1 in 8 species of lichens actually have microcystins, which are caused by the cyanobacteria within them, which can cause significant liver damage. So 1 in 8 species of lichens are highly poisonous. Lichen does have a lot of medicinal uses. They have enzyme, inhibitory, antimicrobial, antifungal, antiviral, anti-cancer, anti-insecticidal, and antioxidant actions, which have all been scientifically proven by modern methods. Many ancient people knew these and so have been using these lichens for these purposes for hundreds and thousands of years. An estimated 50% of all lichen species have antibiotic properties, and that includes some of the ones that are also poisonous. You can use some that are you can use some of the ones that are poisonous topically, but not ingest them. And you can see on the screen here that you can still use lichen in deodorants, for vitamin D supplements, all kinds of other medicinal purposes. Some of the most common ways that lichen was used historically for medicinal purposes was to treat boils and other skin disorders, scarlet fever, pneumonia, genital infections, athlete's foot, and other disorders. In even more ancient times, in Egypt, starting around 1500 BCE, the same tree moss that's used today in French perfume making was used to preserve internal organs. It was packed around the body to preserve it, and then also mixed into a loaf of bread that was buried with the body as a food for the afterlife. And that was such an effective preservative that those loaves of bread have still been found to this day, fairly well preserved, buried with the sarcophaguses. And lichen is actually still used in embalming today, which I find amazing. It's used to create some of the modern day embalming fluids, including cudbear, which is one of the most commonly used embalming fluids. And those use the O'Shea lichen, which is the lichen you see in the upper right-hand corner here. Some lichens are edible by humans. Rock tripe is a common ingredient in Chinese, Japanese, and Korean cuisine, as well as traditional Cree cuisine. Washington's starving soldiers made soup with rock tripe at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania during the winter of 1777 to 1778. And it is good for thickening broth and can be roasted or fried, but don't go out and just start eating it. Different species of rock tripe vary in edibility and desirability and are kind of hard to differentiate from one another visually. All tripes are bitter in their taste and have to be soaked and boiled in several washes of water to render them edible at all. What's left is a rather slimy mass. You can see it presented as best they can in the center picture. It takes a very long time to grow back. I've tried it and it's not that great. I don't recommend it unless you're really starving. Or if it's to your liking. And the other most commonly eaten lichen by humans is horsehair lichen. It was eaten by some Native American communities in times of food scarcity, especially in the Pacific Northwest. I haven't had that one. Apparently it doesn't taste very good at all. Humans aren't the main consumers of lichen, though. Animals are, of course. The species Reindeer Lichen is actually a group of species of lichens, and they are a very important source of winter forage for most North American caribou populations, and it's really the key component of their winter diet. One caribou can eat several pounds of lichen a day. Rabbits, pika, and other northern mammal species really rely on lichens as well. It's one of the main things that they eat throughout the entire, really 3 out of the 4 seasons of the year. In all of lichen's habitats and in all seasons, lichen is a very important food source for invertebrates. So for instance, on the right, you'll see a land snail eating lichen. It's a very common food source for many different types of invertebrates. Lichen is also very commonly used as a nesting material. So birds like the ruby-throated hummingbird, blue-gray gnatcatcher, and Baltimore oriole often use lichen to build and camouflage their nests. And I think they're just lovely, the lichen nests that they create. Lichen also creates tiny forest-like habitats. So there are tardigrades, such as depicted here on the left, who live entirely in lichen habitats. And there are lacewing larvae, like you see on the right, who cover themselves in tiny pieces of dust lichen for camouflage, as well as for antibacterial rain protection, and then create a cocoon out of the lichen in which they metamorphose. There are also nematodes that specifically eat the lichen, the algae that live within lichen. So think about how incredibly small those nematodes have to be to live inside the layers in between the cells of the lichen. And then there are also lichen moths, whose larvae eat lichen and blue-green algae that they find growing on tree trunks. So I could keep going. There are lots of things that very specifically grow in the little tiny habitats that lichen create. Now, one of the very important roles that lichen serves, and we could call it an ecosystem use, is that they fix carbon and nitrogen. Many things fix carbon, but fewer things fix nitrogen to the great extent that lichen does. Lichen covers 7% of the Earth's surface, it's estimated, and so they really have a huge role in carbon and nitrogen fixation. The cyanobacterial photobionts, which I'll describe more in a little bit, are the main part of what participates in the nitrogen fixation. Lichens are also the canaries in the coal mine of air pollution, especially for nitrogen pollution. Because they receive all of their nutrients and water from wet and dry atmospheric fallout, things that come down from the atmosphere, and they have no filtering mechanisms, lichens are sensitive to atmospheric pollution, such as nitrogen, heavy metals, carbon, and sulfur coming into their bodies, into their thalli. It accumulates over the entire life of the lichen. Lichens are able to tell us the effects of air pollution on ecosystems, not just the number of pollution particles in the air. The smaller the size and the less variety of lichens in an area, the more polluted the environment is. Observing the structural changes in sensitive lichen species, including reduced photosynthesis, bleaching, reduced growth, and death of lichen bodies, also shows pollution impacts. Over time, sensitive lichen species may be replaced by pollution-tolerant species, which is an important transition to keep our eyes on. Extracting pollutants from samples of lichen can also give a very firm indication of the levels present in the atmosphere. This image on the screen right now shows the results of such a study, measuring nitrogen sampled from lichens, and the red on this graph is bad. Lichen has actually been used for a very long time for rock dating, so determining the age of rock surfaces. Because lichen growth rates are consistent, they can be used to date the rock surface on which they are growing. This is called lichenometry, and it's applied in archaeology, paleontology, and geomorphology. Lichen can be preserved on old rock faces for up to 10,000 years. Lichen rock dating can also be done in reverse. In cemeteries, for instance, we know exactly how old the headstone rocks are, and so we can use them to measure the growth rates of lichens over hundreds of years. Lichens have lots of other uses, and these are just some of the ones that I found most interesting. Here's a short list of some of the other ones: alcohol production, fiber, fuel, tanning, insect repellent, preservatives, narcotics, production of acid, litmus paper, etc. List goes on. And most of these are still current uses that people are still putting lichen to. Also, the way that I find lichen to be most useful and engaging to me is that they're beautiful. I just like looking at them. Unfortunately, lichens are under threat. We've already started to hint at many of the threats to lichens, and this is part of why I like bringing attention to lichens to help protect them. So we talked about air pollution. Air pollution does seriously impact lichens. Anything we can do to improve air pollution helps lichens. These are images of unhealthy lichens dying of air pollution. The image on the left is from a lichen that's growing near a natural gas burning power plant, and the image of the lichen on the right is a lichen that is growing near a waste incinerator. Lichens are also, as I mentioned, not able to really be commercially grown, and so they are harvested from the wild for all of the aforementioned uses. So that really takes a toll on them. And as we'll talk about in a minute, they take a very long time to grow. So any harvest of lichens is an unsustainable harvest. I can't find any good statistics on how much lichen is harvested annually, but in Oregon alone, it's estimated that 250 tons of lichen is harvested annually. And I already mentioned the 700 tons for perfumes in France. And like I said, lichen is very lightweight, so it takes a lot to make a ton. And these are some of the many lichen products you can buy online. And here's some pictures of some lichen harvests. There are some limits on harvesting. So for instance, on national park lands, collection of any kind is illegal. On national forest lands, it's illegal to collect vegetation without a permit, but permits are easily and often issued. Lichens are covered by the definition of vegetation. On New York State parklands, you can't injure or remove any plants, and lichens are classified as under plants in this category. This classification is buried under the injury to personal property regulations. On private land, there's little to stop overharvesting other than owner permission or lack of permission. Rare and endangered lichens are protected by the relevant laws, but almost no lichens have that designation. Lichens, like other fungi, are poorly represented in conservation efforts in the United States and Canada, as well as most other countries outside of Europe. At the beginning of 2015, only 2 lichens were protected under the U.S. Endangered Species Act, and 2 were listed internationally on the red list of threatened species. 30 more have been submitted by a consortium led by the New York Botanical Garden to be included on the red list, but there hasn't been any progress on that. Lichens are very easily damaged by foot traffic and wheel traffic and not easily regrown. So it's important to keep our feet and wheels on trails in alpine zones and in other highly lichenized landscapes. Lichens are thought to be resilient because they are resilient in their typical habitats to short-term extremes of heat, cold, and the like. So they, for instance, can dry up for a short period of time and appear to resurrect. That makes some people think that they're invulnerable, but they can't move and they can't adapt to salinity or sustained drying or heating conditions. So just like everything else, their main long-term threats are sea level rise, climate change, and urban sprawl. So I've been starting to talk a little bit about some of the things having to do with lichen biology, but let's dig into it and talk about these weird creatures that are lichens. This is the story of lichen biology that most people know, which can be summarized as Freddy fungi and Alice algae took a lichen to each other and got married on the rocks. I mean, it's not wrong in terms of an anthropomorphized explanation. What lichens really are is an example of mutualistic symbiosis or beneficial parasitism. So there's always two partners. There's a fungal partner, which is the microbiont, and the photosynthetic partner, which is the green algae or cyanobacteria, and that's the photobiont. There are also sometimes yeasts involved, but we're not going to get into that today because it gets overly complicated. So the fungal partner, the microbiont, essentially creates a structure. They help to root the whole structure to the substrate, to whatever it's growing out of. They provide an outer core. They provide protection from the elements. And then the photosynthetic partner, the photobiont, the algae or cyanobacteria, lives within the fungal partner, within the microbiont, and provides sugars. And so that's the extremely simple version of what the structure of the inside of a lichen is. So the photobiont provides the microbiont with sugars that are necessary for substance, which is produced through photosynthesis. Now, I think it's fascinating that 98% of the microbionts are from the Ascomyces, the cup fungi family. When the fungus and partner join, both change physically and chemically. The fungus becomes lichenized. And so that's what creates the wide diversity of lichens that we have out in the world. Even though 98% of the microbionts are from the same fungal family, we have, and we'll get to this, more than 25,000 different kinds of lichens in the world. This is another example of an Ascomyces cup fungus. And those of you who know your lichens can probably think of a few lichens that look a lot like this fungus. So here's a little glimpse at the inside of a lichen broken down. The microbiont, as I said, creates the outer rim, the protection, which here is labeled as the cortex. There's an upper and lower cortex in most structures. And there aren't roots that are exactly like roots, but they serve the purpose of roots. They're rhizonae. They aren't really exactly like roots because they don't draw nutrients or water from the substrate. They really just stick it on. So the rhizonae are really just there for the purposes of attachment. And then the entire interior part is the medulla. And think of it like a cotton ball. It just consists of interlaced threads, which are there to provide structure and to create air spaces and to hold large amounts of water. There isn't really a complex purpose for the medulla other than to hold space and to hold air and water. And then what's labeled here as the algal layer could be algae or could be cyanobacteria or both. And that's where it lives. It lives within that space that's created within the center of the lichen. And that's where the sugars are being created through photosynthesis. Here's a very close-up picture of a lichen whose cortex has actually been torn open. You can see how it actually is hollow inside. Now, the outer structure of a lichen, and I'm introducing these terms partially for edification, partially so that you could be familiar with these terms if you were going to be looking something up and you wanted to say that bit. These are the terms you would want to use to refer to. So the thallus is the main body of the lichen. So the main structure that you'd be looking at is the thallus. And the apothecia are the sexually reproductive parts. They're usually the most interesting parts, colorful or lumpy, or just the cool looking parts are usually the apothecia, the sexually reproductive parts of the lichen. They usually produce fungal spores. Not all lichens produce apothecia, and spores can be produced by other structures, but these are the primary spore-producing structures of the lichen. Then many lichens also have isidia, which are like the little fingers, and they are conducive to vegetative reproduction. And vegetative reproduction is when the lichen reproduces by breaking a part of itself off, and that part of itself that breaks off has all the components necessary to grow a new lichen from that. The peditia are the stalk-like structures or pedestals that have apothecia at the end. And not all lichens have this, but those that do, they're pretty noticeable. Then the rhizomes, we mentioned that previously, are the hair-like anchors. They're kind of like roots, but really just are there to attach it. So what are we looking at here? There's the thallus, which is the main body, and then here are some apothecia. That's the sexually reproductive part that'll produce spores. There's the thallus. And here we've got some apothecia. We've got some peditia, some little pedestals. And we've got some little fingers, some little ascidia. And here, what do we got? What do we have here? Some little fingers. Here's some ascidia. Pretty much this whole thing is thallus and ascidia. Now, some people get confused because there are lots of things that are not lichens that grow in the same environment as lichens and look like lichens. So for instance, fungi, algae, and cyanobacteria are all ingredients of lichens, but by themselves are not lichens. And as I mentioned, many of these things look like lichens. And lichen, interestingly, competes with all of these things in the environment, especially with moss. So here's lichen and moss in fierce competition. Lichen is hardier than moss, can withstand more extreme temperature, humidity, and chemical variation. Lichen grows slower than moss. Moss grows faster when conditions are favorable to it. And here's a conversation between some lichen and moss over time. It often results over time in a balanced competition. You might notice the time span in this comic. It's talking about over hundreds of years. That's accurate. Here's a comparison of some lichen over 13 years. I can't emphasize enough how slowly lichens grow. So you can see the growth in these images most easily on the small rings on the left. So sort of to the left of the thing that looks like Mickey Mouse. Think of how old the average lichens you see on rocks and trees are. If this is 13 years of growth, they're usually as old as the trees, and on the rocks, they're often hundreds of years old. And so they take a very long time to grow back if they're damaged. This rock is growing in an area that I know has been undisturbed for approximately 300 years. And so I'm guessing that this lichen is about 300 years old. So morphology, the shapes of lichen is usually how we classify lichens in lichen identification books and forums and general conversations about what kind of lichen am I looking at. So we're going to dig into this a little bit. These are the general ways that lichens are categorized by their shapes. So quite often you'll only see these first three categories: Crestos, Leprose, and Folios. But the bottom two are really just as common. Usually you'll only see Crestos, Folios, and Fruticos, but I've added in Leprose and Squamulose because they really are just as common as the others. So Crestos, I like to think of as crusty. It's a crust on the substrate. So we'll look at some specific examples in a minute. Leprose just looks like a powdery dusting. Folios, if anyone knows their Latin, it is indeed what it sounds like. It's a leaf. It looks like a lettuce leaf or something. Squamulose are some scales, and Fruticos has a very specific definition. All the rest are pretty general categories, but Fruticos is a bushy structure branching with cylindrical branches from a single point of attachment. And you might want to write these down And I'm going to give you another chance on the next slide here. Here's some highly simplified drawings to give you an example of what each of these categories look like. So you've got the Crestos, which is a little crusty crust, the Folios, leaves, the Fruticos, branching cylindrical attachment, single point of attachment, Lepros, powdery dust, and squamulous scales. So here's an example of a Crestos lichen. As you see, it's just sort of a crust on top of the substrate here. It's growing on rock. Crestos lichens you'll more often see on rocks, but they can grow also on wood. Now, Crestos lichens are different from the other types of lichens in that they really grow into the substrate. So here, this Crestos lichen is actually slowly over time breaking down the rock that it's growing on. Here's some more Crestos lichen. Now, is this a picture of lichen? Or is this just a picture of a piece of bark? It's covered in Lepros lichen, a powdery dust. You might think it's mold. It's actually a Lepros lichen here. Kind of hard to tell. I wanted to give you sort of an extreme version. These ones are easier to tell. And Lepros lichens, as you can see, have actually over time inspired many camo patterns. On both the left and right, you can see that some tiny apothecia. So these are actually producing spores here. On the right, it's white on white. On the left, it's black apothecia on the various gray Lepros lichen spots. And then Folios, these are some of the more obvious ones. They look like lettuce leaves stuck to the side of a tree or a rock. And sometimes they wrap around a branch. Here it is growing all over a rock. Looks like a salad rock. And the squamulous ones, it's a little hard to see since we're talking about a screen, but now imagine we're looking really through a magnifying glass. So these are much smaller than what we were just looking at. The little tiny scales. You'll often see these growing at the base of a tree, so where the tree has just grown up out of the ground. Squamulous lichens love growing on that area. Also on dead stumps. Squamulous just love dead stumps. Covered in little scales. And for size reference, looking at the Folios lichens on the right, that's about 1.5 inches wide. And then the tiny little scales on the left. Try to get a sense of the difference between the Folios and the squamulous. Then onto Fruticos. So this is bushy, branching body with cylindrical branches stemming from a single point of attachment. This is about the most classic example of that you can find. These do grow on all types of substrate. So you'll find these on wood, ground, or rocks, most commonly on wood, secondly, most commonly on the ground, occasionally on rock. And here's a whole bunch of Fruticos. These little powder puff ones growing all over the ground, little tiny trees. All right, here's a quiz. You can answer to yourselves, or if you feel like it, put it in the chat. What kind of lichen is this? What morphology? All right, I'm going to put the answer out. Folios. All right, let's keep going here. How about this one? We've got Crestos, and you might have also noticed Folios over here. What about this? Mostly Fruticos, bushy single point of attachment, branching bodies, etc. And then there are tiny folios up at the top. There's usually folios in the picture somewhere. Now I laughed when I saw this branch because, oh my gosh, what have we got here? So we've got folios, we've got Crestos, we've got a different kind of Crestos, we've got a different kind of folio. We've got a little Fruticos there. And this one is, you know, I've labeled that as moss, but that's actually not moss, that's a scale wort. All right, so here, what do we have? You'll notice these are getting increasingly challenging. This is what it looks like to actually try to look at things in the real world. So we've got folios up at the top there, those leafy leaves. Does it look like a salad leaf? If so, folios. We've got squamulous scales. These are actually bigger than the scales usually look. We've got that scaly shape there. We've got a fruticose, so the cylindrical branches coming out there. We've got some powdery powder, lepros, right there in the center. And then a different kind of folios right there at the bottom. There's probably more going on there, but those are the obvious ones. Now, as I said, increasingly challenging. So this is a piece of bark that is, I'm going to say, an 1.5 inches wide, if that gives you any help. So now I'm going to zoom in. Now we're looking at about 2 millimeters. It's folios. Tiny, 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 tiny little folios. So you think, and flipping back, you think, oh, it must be lepros. It looks like a powdery powder. But you really have to get out your loupe or your magnifying glass and look really closely sometimes to see that the scale of these things can be all over the place. So you can have pretty big scales on squamulous, like in the last one, and really tiny leaves sometimes for things like this. So same thing here. What's that in the middle? Is that, there's a folios. That folios is pretty up. There's a tiny, tiny Fruticos. Look at that. It is so small. And what the heck is this? Modern art? It's squamulous in its sexually reproductive phase. So that's a squamulous poditia with the epithisia at the end, but scaly version. Covered in frog's eggs? Don't worry, this is the last one, and I think this is about as hard as it gets. So when you don't know, you have to look at the edges. So this is just crazy to look at, but if you look at the very edges have that sort of leafy like pattern. And so we're able to eventually figure out its folios covered in epithisia. So that gives us enough to start to look things up in a book or an equivalent identification sources, which we'll get into later, to figure out what species we're looking at. Now, it's hard to sometimes drill down to the exact species level because lichens, as I mentioned, cover 7% of the Earth's surface. And there are between 17,000 and 25,000 species worldwide. There have been 3,600 species identified in the US and Canada so far, and 800 species identified in New York. And really, we're just starting. There are new species of lichens identified every year. And so if this is something that's interesting to you, if you want to name something after yourself or your dog or whatever, get into lichens, because there is a lot more to learn and a lot more to identify. So what do we look for? If we're looking at a lichen, we're like, what the heck is this? What am I looking at? First, as with most things, where am I? Where is it growing? What is the specific location? What is the environment? Am I by the side of a stream? Am I in the middle of a city? Is that city specifically Ithaca? Or where is the location? On what is it growing? You might have noticed throughout the whole previous section I was mentioning, this type will usually grow on wood, this type will usually grow on the ground, etc. The substrate is usually, as with most fungal things, very important to identifying it. What shape type is it? So that was the whole morphology. Is it a squamulous shape? Is it a folio shape? Is it Crestos shape? Does it have any distinguishing reproductive features? So does it have like really tall pedicia? Is it covered in apothecia? Any of those things can be very helpful. Now, that's about as far as most people can get in being able to identify their lichens, and that's okay, because that'll get you pretty close. But to positively identify a lichen species, for instance, for most scientific purposes, you have to be able to get beyond the red line that I just put on the screen. So this is beyond, for instance, my usual abilities. I don't usually bring chemicals out into the field. I don't usually have access to a thin layer chromatography lab and other such things. But if I found a lichen that I, really think is going to be the air roads lichen, I would try to responsibly get permission to source it and put it through some of these other tests to make sure it's not just a weird form of a pre-existing lichen. Because these tests below the red line are considered to be necessary for positive identification in most cases. This is probably the most common species of lichen. You probably saw this today. You'll probably see this every day of your life. It's a green shield, and there are different kinds of green shields. This one is either a common green shield or a Cumberland green shield. I say it's one or the other because, I can't positively identify it because I don't have chemicals. But they're pretty much the same thing. The difference between them is essentially irrelevant. And so I just call it a green shield. And this is one of those 50-mile-an-hour identification ones. Yep, I can see one outside my window right now. They are everywhere, and they grow in a very wide-ranging habitat. They grow on trees, they grow on rocks. They don't usually grow in the ground. I have seen them on asphalt occasionally, but they're very common, and they do a lot of work with nitrogen and carbon fixation. Here's one of my other favorites. You'll see these growing high in the trees. So actually they're quite common, but you might not see them very often. But now that I've mentioned them, you'll probably see them more often. So some people think that they're air plants. Some people think that they're Spanish moss or other types of parasitic things. They have really no impact on the trees in which they grow. But if you just, if you're in a moist forest, look up into the trees, you'll see blotches up in the trees, and I guarantee you, I can't guarantee, I would be willing to bet money it's crumpled drag lichen going way up in the canopy of the trees. And sometimes you can see species, specimens, if you go into a forest after there's been a windstorm, and they'll blow down after a windstorm, and you'll find them on the ground. Rock shields are very common. Despite the name, they actually grow just as commonly on wood. This one is either a peppered rock shield or a Cumberland or shingled rock shield. Cumberland and shingled rock shield, two names for the same thing. And peppered rock shield looks almost exactly the same. With this one, it's that sort of squamulose-ish valley-y, even though it is a Folios lichen. And then those sort of curled brown apothecia with the little green rim around the edge. I think they're kind of lacy looking. And I actually see them more often growing on trees at sort of eye level height than I do on rocks. Now this is one of my favorites, elegant sunburst, or Xanthorrhea elegans, although it was actually just given a new Latin name because of some reclassification, but everyone still calls it Xanthorrhea elegans. And this lichen is very common, and it really likes places of high nutrient environments. Despite that, it's actually been very happily growing on the outside of the International Space Station. They put it there as a sort of little like joke experiment, and it took off. And so they're just leaving it there to see how long and how well it grows. I've been amazed at this ongoing experiment. Usually, it's an indication of nutrient-rich environments, especially rich in nitrogen and calcium. So usually it's an indication of poop or pee. So it can be very useful for identifying bird roosts, coyote peeing trees, and other animal habitats, especially if those animals aren't there at the time. If you're trying to follow a coyote trail or figure out where to put up a game camera, things like that, look for Xanthorrhea elegans. Rock tripe, we talked about rock tripe. This one really only grows on rock, especially exposed boulders and ledges, usually brown with a black underside. There are occasionally some sort of lighter green species. Its thalassas can be as big as my palm or as small as my pinky fingernail. And this one sometimes looks very prolific. It actually grows extremely slowly, and it's considered to be one of the oldest living things that we have as a land. We can't really call it as a land species. It really is considered to be very closely related to many of the things that actually are now considered to be seaweeds. And moving on to the Fruticos lichens, we mentioned reindeer lichen. There are a lot of different kinds of reindeer lichens, and specifying between them usually requires a magnifying glass and a lot of focus. Here are two different kinds of reindeer lichens. Actually, looking closely, there's three different kinds of reindeer lichens in that picture. Looking at this picture, most people think this would be Spanish moss. Spanish moss is not Spanish, nor is it a moss, nor is it a lichen. It's a parasitic plant. This, however, in the picture is a lichen. It is a Fruticos lichen that grows in the branches of forests where there is high humidity, so fog, rain, or sea spray. The family of these lichens are called Usnea, and usually the lichens in this family are just called Usnea. This one and others like it with this sort of shape are called old man's beard. That's not really the name of the species, it's more of a descriptor of a large group of types of Usnea lichens. Getting into the Crestos lichens, Cinder lichens are a common form of Crestos lichen. The random pattern of black dots is what makes them be called Cinder lichens. And sometimes you'll see when the dots form perfect concentric circles, and those are called concentric boulder lichens. Map lichens is a different category of lichens. So I don't know if you can look at this picture and see a map. Think of it as a map of a village with a few dense streets and houses marked out on the street, surrounded by countryside. And this one specifically is yellow map lichen, very creatively named. The squamulus species vary the most one to another visually. There are many different kinds of Pixie Cups, for instance, and they're hard to differentiate between one another. You really have to use your loupe. So here we have Pixie Cups and pebbled Pixie Cups, slightly different. The Pixie Cups actually keep, in my opinion, the closest form to the original Ascomyces cup fungi. So it didn't vary too much from the original form there. British soldiers are one of the most iconic lichens, and they are a type of squamulus lichen. You might say, wait, squamulus, where are the scales? Usually, British soldiers grow in the environments where the moss or other surrounding environment subsumes the thallus of the lichen. So you can't often see the scaly part it's growing out of. There are a lot of other things that look a lot like British soldiers, but aren't actually technically British soldier lichens. So for instance, there's lipstick powderhorn, which has unbranched stalks, and red fruit Pixie Cups, which has the red inconsistently along the edge of a goblet shape. So there are a lot of things that are British soldier-ish. I'm showing you the mealy Pixie Cup, not only because it's a common species in itself, but also because it's hard to differentiate it from the dragon horn, which is one of my favorite, personal favorites. If there are cup structures present, then it's the mealy Pixie Cup. If there are no cups and a crazier zigzag shape and a more textured surface, then it's the dragon horn. Of course, they like to grow together and make it hard on us. In just a minute, I'll show you how to get a full list of the lichens in your area. Of course, this is all getting more complicated as we start to do DNA testing. We've learned recently that one species of lichen is actually 126 or more separate species of lichens. And so it's really expanding our understanding of lichen classification. So that previous number I threw at you of between 17,000 and 25,000 species of lichens is an old number and doesn't include this new understanding of DNA classification. So there are so many more species of lichens than we thought they were. All right, so if you are interested in learning more, good news, there's really great resources out there. This is the book that got me hooked, Lichens of the North Woods by Joe Wallowesky. It's a great place to start, and I definitely recommend it. It is technically written for the North Woods of like the Minnesota area, but we really have a huge overlap, especially in northern New York. So anyone from like the northern Catskills up, this would be very applicable. It's not going to keep your interest for very long. So if you get this book and get into it, after a year or two, you're going to want something else. But it's a great starter. For anyone who's in an urban context, so if you are in New York City or any other really urbanized landscape, there are a lot of lichens there and very specific lichens that thrive in those environments. So I highly recommend the Urban Lichens Field Guide for Northeastern North America by Jessica Allen and James C. Lendermer. It's a new book, and so it's full of some really great new information and resources. And this is sort of the gold standard. It keeps going out of print, and they keep trying to print more. It's printed by the New York Botanical Garden, Common Lichens of Northeastern North America, a field guide. Excellent, highly recommend it. Good luck finding a copy. Luckily, you don't have to buy a book because there are some excellent online resources, including those made by the Consortium of North American Lichen Herbaria. What a great club name. If you just go to lichenportal.org, you can access all of their resources. And it's a great community overall. I recommend going to the search function and going to the dynamic species list. And you can set your location and set the radius as tight or as broad as you want, and then check display as images. And from that, you'll have a visual identification of all the species of lichens in your area. So again, go to lichenportal.org, search dynamic species list, set your radius, and check display as images. And you have your own personalized lichen identification book. You can also use lichenportal.org's map function to search by family or species if you think you know what you found, to see where it appears, to sort of check yourself, or just out of curiosity. So here, for instance, I searched for lungwort lichen, which, as you see, doesn't occur very frequently. It's a rather, I'm not going to say rare, but uncommon lichen, because it requires very high air quality. And so it occurs infrequently in other places, but much more frequently in the higher altitude areas of the Adirondacks and the White Mountains. I use iNaturalist for other things, but not really so much for lichens. Because if you look on iNaturalist, for instance, you'll see that there are only 3,000 some odd species identified on iNaturalist. There's not a lot of good information on iNaturalist about lichens, and mostly because they're not easily categorized there, because they're all first lumped under the fungi that is lichenized. Not a good classification system. And there are not very many knowledgeable lichenologists on iNaturalist. There's just also a lot of totally misidentified things on iNaturalist. So don't trust what you see there. We could change that by helping to upload good observations and identifying the ones that are there, but it's a lifetime of work. So I don't recommend that being your go-to source for seeking out identifications or using the auto-identify function. And I just want to leave a little bit of time here at the end for questions. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Well, first of all, there's my contact information. I'll put that in the chat as well. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and make some time for questions. Great, and I see there's some in the chat box. While I look at this, I'm just going to quickly type my contact information into the chat box here. There's me. All right, so have you thought about what you would name a lichen if you discovered a new species? I like that question. I think it would depend on what the lichen looked like. I think I would really go for sort of a visual cue. So, you know, if it was fuzzy, I might name it the teddy bear lichen or something like that. But I don't have a particular person who I'd want to honor or anything like that. So lichens grow super slowly and you can't grow them commercially, and there's all this lichen harvesting going on for multiple products. Are we going to see lichens on the endangered species list soon? Well, there are 2 lichens that are officially on the endangered species list, the International Endangered Species List, which is called the Red List. But there should be a lot more. So there are 30 that have been identified that should be on that list. And many states have specific state endangered lists. So for instance, New York, I know, has 2 that they want recognized as endangered lichens. Maine is trying to get 2 identified as endangered, but that's just the most obvious. These are the ones that, like, well, clearly we need to recognize these ones as endangered. There are many others that, many others that are highly threatened, probably endangered, that we might not even know they exist in the first place. These are just the ones we know about. And so the populations that we have identified and know are threatened, it's considerable. So in short, yes, very much yes. How to tell a mealy pixie cup and a dragon horn apart? So dragon horns will never have cups. Dragon horns also have crazier zigzags and just in general, just a wackier appearance and never cups. Mealy pixie cups generally look like dragon horns, just a little less crazy, and they have cups. And let's see. If lichen normally grows so slowly, is it lichen growing on tree trunks, branches that appears within a few years? Yes. Yeah, lichens can appear, you know, within a year of a tree, and usually will just grow concurrently with the life of a tree. So for instance, there's a tree that's growing in my front yard that's 5 years old, and it has a little baby 5-year-old lichen on it. So it's actually sometimes a useful way to see the growth rates of different lichens. Scrolling back here, is there a proper way to harvest lichen? I mean, I don't think harvesting lichen is really ever a good idea unless there's a reason you need it, because of how slowly it grows back. And since there's no way that we can increase its growth rate or growth production in general, not really, not that I know of. So who does all of this harvesting of lichen? It's you know, it's the same way that people sort of as a individual job will do harvesting of wild mushrooms or harvesting of pretty much any other wild forage product. So some people have their full-time job going out and harvesting lichen. Sometimes people just do it seasonally. I am living up here in Maine now, and so it's a pretty noticeable thing. People will go out and come out with a whole bed of their pickup truck full of trays of lichen and sell it to whatever vendor they have a relationship with. And that happens in the Adirondacks as well, Catskills, anywhere where there's a lichen-rich environment. Scrolling back here. All right, does anyone have any questions that I don't see typed into the chat that you want to either voice in person or add now?
I have a question, Air. How stable are the dyes that are made with lichen?
Can you say that again?
How stable are the dyes that are made with lichen? Are they pretty stable? Are they long lasting, or do they fade?
They're very stable. I mean, they have to be fixed with an acid, as most natural dyes do. But if they're done right the first time, I mean, I have some old right here. You know, I have some things that were dyed with lichen that were created hundreds of years ago. In some cases, you know, I personally have only seen those in museum situations, but like, yeah, I mean, this was dyed in Scotland with, you know, with lichens and other natural products. And I sit with this thing every day. It's been through hell and high water with me, and it's, you know, it's got crisp, bright colors. And yeah, I mean, the kilts that people wear usually receive a lot of very heavy use. And so the fact that the samples we have from hundreds of years ago are still, you know, crisp and colorful. So I think that they're really remarkable dyes.
Wonderful, thank you.
Do lichens growing on live trees hurt the trees? No, they don't hurt the trees at all. The rhizines that affix the lichens to the trees, unless it's a Crestos lichen, they aren't breaking down the bark, they aren't drawing water or any nutrients from the bark. Crestos lichens do very slowly over time break down the structure of the substrate that they're growing on, but it's an extremely slow process. And in the case of bark, excuse me, the bark usually has so many layers that the tree can regrow any layers of cell structure that the Crestos lichen is breaking down much faster than the lichen can break it down. So it's not considered ever to be harmful to any living tree surfaces. I showed a pollution map and its impact on lichens. Is that from coal power plants? It's from any of the sources of nitrogen pollution. So coal is certainly one of them, and many other industrial pollutants. So for instance, waste incineration is a major cause of nitrogen in our atmosphere. Many other industrial practices, commercial refrigerant practices, battery production, actually, I could keep going. Nitrogen comes from a lot of different sources in our industry, usually not from residential, but from industrial sources. That's why you might have noticed it was actually centered more sort of in the like Detroit area rather than the more population heavy East Coast.
Thank you so much. That was great information. I look forward to trying to start to identify some lichen myself. I think it would be fun. It's like an unexplored, completely unexplored area for me. Oh, now Adrian, it says the next one needs to be a webinar on moss. Do you know anything about moss there?
Not my expertise, but I love it. So I would love to attend that one.
All right. If anybody is an expert on moss, I'd like to know about that. So
there's a question here I would love to answer really quickly. Have you seen or heard of the bubblegum colored lichen that grows on live oaks near Savannah, Georgia? If it's the one I'm thinking of, one of its common names is fairy puke or fairy barf. And yes, Sorry to interrupt you, Christy. I just couldn't help but mentioning.
Oh, that's okay. No, that was a great opportunity.
So I really appreciate everyone listening and for your patience, and Christy for giving me the opportunity to share my enthusiasm.